Welcome to True Echo, where the stories we tell echo the truth behind power, identity, and redemption. In today's powerful episode, what starts as a cruel insult on a dusty construction site erupts into one of the most dramatic power shifts ever witnessed, proving once and for all that what's beneath the surface might just be the foundation that holds everything up. The sun was already high above the sprawling Eaglestone construction site, casting long streaks of light across steel beams and stacks of cement blocks. Amid the clatter of tools and the rumble of machines, the dusty trailer near the center of the site became the stage for something no one expected, a confrontation that would echo far beyond its walls. "Can you be quiet and let the professionals speak?" The voice belonged to Marcus Ellison, the site's chief engineer, and it cracked like a whip through the dry air. He stood tall and smug, pointer in hand, facing a man in a worn-out work jacket, Jamal Carter, a black construction worker who had dared to raise a concern during the morning briefing. "We don't pay construction workers to think," Marcus continued, voice dipped in disdain. "We pay them to follow orders." Jamal didn't flinch. He stood rooted, his calloused hands resting on the blueprint he'd quietly unfolded minutes before. The tension in the room thickened. Around them, a mix of junior engineers, interns, and site managers exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. "With all due respect," Jamal finally said, voice calm and even, "the northeast corner's design doesn't account for the natural slope. If you pour the foundation as is, the structure will develop misalignment stress. Uneven settlement is inevitable." A few heads subtly nodded. Some had noticed it too. But Marcus smirked, turning to the group with performative derision. "Did you hear that? The cement guy is now lecturing us on slope dynamics. Maybe I should give him my Stanford degree." A couple of forced chuckles echoed behind him, not out of humor but self-preservation. No one wanted to be Marcus's next target. Jamal's expression didn't change. He simply rolled up the blueprint, his gaze calm, unwavering, as though he'd seen this act 100 times before. Marcus, however, wasn't done. He stepped closer, pointer in hand like a baton in an orchestra of control. "This is why we have layers of management. People like me make decisions. People like you execute them. That's the order." But something about Jamal's silence unsettled Marcus. There was no anger. No challenge. Just that unsettling calm. And calm in moments like this was power. The meeting lurched back into motion. Marcus returned to his cost slide presentation, rambling about deadlines and budget constraints, pretending the interruption hadn't happened. But Jamal? Jamal pulled out a phone. Not a modern smartphone. A dusty old Nokia 3310. He typed 11 characters. KT3P15 callback. He hit send. No one noticed. No one knew. But that single text would tilt the axis of the entire project. When Jamal exited the trailer, he didn't walk like someone who had just been belittled. His stride was steady, measured. His jacket billowed slightly in the summer breeze as he moved past the cement mixers, the rebar cages, and toward the storage lot where his silver sedan sat coated in construction dust. Inside the trailer, Marcus sipped his coffee, feeling victorious. "See," he told his assistant Jared. "These guys think because they've mixed enough cement they're structural engineers." Jared smiled awkwardly, eyes flicking to the window as Jamal disappeared behind the prefab office containers. Something didn't feel right. It was in Jamal's silence. The type of silence that wasn't born from fear but from patience. A vibration. Jamal glanced at his phone. Confirmed. 14:45. "Ready." He tucked the phone away. The clock on the admin trailer's wall ticked toward 1:30 p.m. Inside, Marcus was still gloating. Outside, the air had changed. And no one, absolutely no one, had the faintest idea who Jamal Carter really was. "Understood." 15 minutes later, a black Mercedes-Benz pulled through the rusted main gate without fanfare. No flashing lights. No security motorcade. Just a smooth, silent arrival that caused heads to turn across the lot. Inside the trailer, Marcus's phone rang. He casually glanced down at the message, and froze. Urgent. Unannounced inspection. Chairman Thomas C. Morgan arriving in 15 minutes. All management to assemble. His hand stopped midair, the coffee in his cup barely trembling. The name Thomas C. Morgan was almost mythical. The founder. The reclusive chairman. A man who hadn't set foot on a site in over 5 years. Last time he did, an entire regional manager team was fired. Marcus's skin went cold. Jared, he snapped. Get everyone ready. Fix the presentation boards. Get the blueprints. Clean this mess up now. Outside, as workers started murmuring about the unfamiliar luxury car, Jamal stood beside his sedan, now changed. Gone was the dusty jacket. In its place, a crisp white shirt, a tailored navy suit. Silver-rimmed glasses sat firmly on the bridge of his nose. He carried a worn leather briefcase and a silent authority. By the time the black Mercedes stopped and the security agent opened the door, the crowd gathered at the edge of the site expected a powerful executive to step out. They weren't wrong. Jamal stepped forward. And the moment Marcus saw him, standing there in a suit, looking 10 feet tall despite the dust still clinging to the hem of his trousers, he understood. Too late. He stepped forward hesitantly, stammering. We were expecting Chairman Thomas C. Morgan? Jamal extended his hand with the stillness of a man who had waited decades for this moment. Thomas Jamal Carter Morgan, he said. Founder, CEO. And the worker you tried to silence. A hush spread like wildfire across the site. Marcus's mouth opened, but no words came out. The mask had been ripped off. The foundation had cracked. And the reckoning was just beginning. Marcus Ellison stood paralyzed, his polished shoes glued to the dusty gravel as murmurs rippled through the construction site. The man he had mocked in front of everyone, dismissed as just a cement worker, was now shaking hands with the district's top safety inspector and giving direct orders to security staff. No one, not even the assistant engineers or site managers, could find their voices. Behind Jamal, Thomas Jamal Carter Morgan, a team of internal auditors began emerging from the secondary vehicle that had followed the Mercedes in. Dressed in gray and black, they moved with purpose, carrying secure briefcases and iPads. I want a full inspection of the Northeast Foundation by 1500, Thomas ordered. His voice was calm but crisp. Compare the on-ground conditions to the blueprints. Cross-check the soil compression tests. Yes, sir, came the unified response from the technical team. Marcus finally found the nerve to step forward, still half believing this might be some elaborate stunt. Sir, Chairman, I wasn't aware of your arrival. If I'd known. That's exactly the problem, Thomas interrupted, his tone cool, void of theatrics. If you had known, you would have behaved. But because you didn't, you revealed who you really are. Gasps and subtle nods began circulating through the onlookers. Jared, Marcus's assistant, slowly stepped backward, choosing to quietly disappear into the crowd. Thomas turned toward the admin trailer. Everyone inside. We have decisions to make. The atmosphere in the trailer-turned boardroom was suffocating. The air conditioning hummed softly, but no one dared move. Marcus sat stiffly at the head of the long fold-out table. Around him were the senior project staff, engineers, logistics supervisors, safety officers. Across from them, Thomas stood flanked by Walter Green, the old site supervisor who had known him since the earliest days, and 2 audit team members. Thomas set a tablet on the table and connected it to the projector. With a simple tap, the screen blinked to life. A blueprint appeared, one Marcus recognized instantly. The Northeast Foundation, Thomas said. This morning I raised concerns about slope misalignment. The response I received was mockery. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. A red circle lit up on the screen. This area, he continued, is under unaccounted pressure from the slope. Today, level 1 structural cracks have begun to appear, just as I predicted. The room was silent. We reviewed the test logs and inspection reports, Walter added, placing a thick file on the table. We found alterations. Microscopic settlement had already started last week. The signs were there. The warnings were buried. Thomas didn't even glance at Marcus. Instead, he turned to the engineering team. I need to know, who among you flagged these issues? Aaron Langley, the foundation supervisor, stood slowly. I did. Twice. My reports were overruled. By whom? Thomas asked. Aaron hesitated, then looked at Marcus. Him. Derek Owens, in charge of materials testing, stood next. I reported anomalies in the steel's compression resistance. The report was deleted from the risk portal within a day. And then, from the far end of the table, a young intern barely out of college whispered, I noticed the foundation was settling more than normal. I didn't say anything. I was scared. Thomas nodded. That's the truth, isn't it? Not technical error. Culture. Silence. He walked slowly to the whiteboard and picked up a marker. In large, deliberate letters he wrote, Silence is dangerous. Then he turned to Marcus. "Do you have anything to say?" Marcus's face was pale. His tie, once perfectly knotted, was now skewed slightly to the left. Sweat glistened at his temples. I was just trying to keep the project on schedule. We had pressure from above. The rain caused delays. If we skipped some steps, we could hit the bonus targets." Thomas raised a hand, halting him mid-excuse. "So you falsified reports, approved inferior materials, ignored safety warnings, and for what? A few $1,000s in quarterly bonuses." Marcus stammered. "It was more than that." "No, Marcus. It wasn't," Thomas said sharply. "It was exactly that." The room fell into a deeper silence. A silence not of shock, but of confirmation. Many had suspected. Some had even known. But no one had imagined the scale. Walter opened a manila envelope and laid out 2 sheets of paper. "Marcus Ellison," he said, "you have 2 options." Thomas folded his arms and stared down at him. "Option 1. Termination for technical negligence and ethical violations. We'll file a formal report with the state board. You'll lose your license, your standing, and likely face civil litigation." Marcus swallowed, his mouth suddenly bone dry. "Option 2, Thomas continued, you resign. Immediately. You return your bonus. And for the next 6 months you work, voluntarily, as a technical instructor at our nonprofit training center for underprivileged youth." Marcus blinked. "No salary? No title," Thomas replied. "Just you, your knowledge, and the people you ignored. You'll teach the very voices you refused to hear." He stepped back. "You have 5 minutes." Marcus looked down at the 2 documents in front of him. One was the end. The other, perhaps, a form of beginning. Outside, the workers had begun to gather. No one knew the details, but rumors moved fast. The worker Marcus had mocked was the founder, the CEO, the architect of their entire careers. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the site's dusty yard, the admin trailer door opened. Thomas Carter stepped out, hands behind his back, his suit coat fluttering slightly in the breeze. He walked up to a makeshift wooden platform made of 2 stacked crates. No microphone. No speaker. Just his voice. "For those of you who don't know me," he began, "my name is Thomas Jamal Carter, founder of Eaglestone Constructions." A wave of gasps rippled through the crowd. "For the past 4 weeks I've worked beside you under the name Jamal. No suit. No office. Just a bucket and a shovel. I did this to see what kind of company we've become." His voice carried across the open yard. "And I saw greatness. I saw hard-working people, ignored, unheard, but resilient. I also saw something else, silence. A culture where the wrong people hold power and the right people are told to shut up." He paused. "As of today that changes." The yard, once filled with noise, went completely still. Thomas looked out across the sea of faces. "The chief engineer of this site has officially resigned. Effective immediately. For violations of safety, ethics, and trust." No cheers followed. No one smiled. Because this wasn't revenge. This was justice. And justice, real justice, always leaves people humbled. Thomas continued, "Starting next week, we launch the Voice from the Ground program. Every worker will have the right to report safety or structural concerns directly to the executive board. No interference. No retaliation." He let the words settle. "Because from now on, this company will rise not on concrete, but on character." The crowd didn't erupt. They didn't clap like in the movies. They just stood a little taller. Shoulders straighter. Spines steelier. Because for the first time, someone had heard them. And believed they mattered. As Thomas stepped down from the makeshift platform, the weight of his words settled into the very soil of the construction yard like fresh concrete. Workers who had felt invisible for years now stood shoulder to shoulder, their quiet dignity magnified in the fading light. No applause was needed. Their silence held more power than any sound ever could. Back inside the operations trailer, Marcus Ellison sat hunched in the same chair that had once felt like a throne. In front of him were 2 documents, each a path. One a professional death sentence. The other a humbling sentence of service. And behind him, the murmurs of workers who once feared him now echoed from outside, sounding less like whispers and more like a verdict. He stared at the voluntary resignation form. 6 months. No title. No pay. Just the chance to teach. To rebuild the very foundation he had once undermined, only this time with truth. With trembling fingers he picked up the pen. He didn't sign it quickly. There was no rush now, no deadline to meet, no bonus to chase. Only accountability. A signature later, and his reign was officially over. Marcus Ellison stepped out of the trailer holding a cardboard box, standard issue for every corporate exile. Inside were his personal belongings, a thermos, some binders, and a framed photo of him shaking hands with an investor at a conference. He clutched the box to his chest like a child hugging something that no longer offered comfort. The yard parted slightly as he passed. No jeers. No cruel smiles. Just eyes, watching a fallen man walk not to his car, but to something deeper, the consequences of years of arrogance. Thomas stood off to the side, arms crossed, watching Marcus walk. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. Instead, he gave the slightest of nods. Not forgiveness. Acknowledgement. Walter Green approached Thomas, hands behind his back. He chose option 2, he said quietly. Thomas exhaled through his nose. Woodrow Technical Center, he said. 6 months. Start him Monday. Make sure they give him the same uniform everyone else wears. Walter raised a brow. You still believe in redemption, huh? Thomas turned to look at the tower crane in the distance, silhouetted against the sunset. If I didn't, this whole company would be a lie. The next Monday, the faded green walls of Woodrow Technical Training Center saw a new instructor walk through its doors. No one recognized him. And that was the point. Gone was the chief engineer's swagger. Marcus wore plain khakis, a button-down shirt with rolled sleeves and no badge of authority. He stood in front of classroom 4B holding a chalk stick, eyes scanning the diverse group of students. Young women and men, former dropouts, ex-juvenile offenders, kids from underfunded schools. Many of them had never seen a rebar blueprint, never touched a leveling instrument. They didn't know Marcus's past, and he didn't offer it. Instead, he started simply. This is a structural diagram, he said, drawing slowly. But what holds it together isn't what you see here, it's what you understand beneath it. The students watched. Not because he demanded attention, but because there was something in his voice now that hadn't existed before. Humility. On the other side of a narrow glass window, Thomas and Gregory Mitchell stood watching. Greg, ever the skeptic, crossed his arms. Think he'll last the full 6 months? Thomas didn't take his eyes off the classroom. He'll do more than last. He'll learn for the first time. Inside, Marcus corrected a student's measurement gently. If the soil shifts by even 1 degree, he said, the entire foundation can tilt. That's not theory. That's life. The students nodded. Not because they were afraid to speak, but because, for once, they were being taught by someone who had failed and come back not to boast, but to teach from his bruises. And that made all the difference. 3 months later, the transformation was undeniable. Marcus wasn't just teaching anymore. He was mentoring. He started arriving early, often reviewing past assignments and improving his own notes. He learned every student's name, something he'd never done with half the team at Eaglestone. One student, Terrence, had trouble understanding pressure calculations. In the past, Marcus might have barked instructions. Now he sat beside the boy and redrew the diagram by hand. Look, he said. This point here, it bears more than weight. It bears responsibility. You get this wrong? You're not just off by numbers. You could hurt someone. Terrence nodded, eyes wide with understanding. So we're not just building buildings? Marcus smiled faintly. We're building trust. That same day, a girl named Myra, the youngest in the class, finally grasped slump testing. Her eyes lit up as she nailed the reading for the first time. Nice, Marcus said quietly, the praise rare, but now sincere. Do it again. Show me it wasn't luck. She did. Flawlessly. From the hallway, Thomas Carter stood again, watching through the window. The same way he once watched Marcus lead with pride, now he saw something even better. Marcus leading with purpose. At the 6-month mark, Marcus received job offers, 3 in total. 1 from a firm in Texas. 1 from a Denver contractor. The last, a lucrative position at a multinational in Zurich. He read them all in his small apartment one evening, the papers spread across his old coffee table. Each came with high salaries, relocation support, and even signing bonuses. But as his eyes scanned the names, titles, and perks, he felt nothing. Instead, he thought of Myra's questions. Terrence's face. The way students had begun asking him for help not just in class but in life. And then he made a choice. He walked into Thomas Carter's office late one afternoon. The setting sun cast gold across the hardwood floor as Marcus set an envelope down on the desk. He stood tall, but not like before. This time not because of pride, but because of peace. I didn't accept any of the offers, he said. Thomas didn't look surprised. Why? There's more to do here, Marcus replied. There are a few students I'm not ready to leave behind yet. He chuckled softly, almost shyly. A few months ago, I couldn't even remember my junior engineers' names. Now I know every student. Every one of them. Thomas nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then stay. Marcus sat down, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. Two men who had once stood on opposite sides of a painful line. I used to think leadership was about standing above, Marcus said. Now I realize, it's about standing among. Thomas leaned back in his chair. If that's the foundation you're building from now, then you're finally ready to rise. And for the first time in a very long time, Marcus Ellison believed it. The cold wind blew down from the north, rustling loose tarps and fluttering safety flags strung across the Eaglestone Extension project on the city's east side. Despite the chill, the energy on site was warm, almost reverent. Something had changed, not just in how people worked but in how they walked, how they stood, how they spoke. On that particular afternoon, Thomas Carter arrived earlier than expected, strolling past the logistics zone in his usual understated fashion. No suit, no bodyguards, just a navy coat and his steel-toed boots. He paused briefly by the training zone, now repurposed as a semi-permanent mentorship site where interns and junior staff met weekly with seasoned field experts. And today the session was led by none other than Marcus Ellison. Gone were the condescending diagrams, the clipped tone of impatience, the inflated vocabulary that once veiled insecurity as superiority. In their place stood a man grounded not just in knowledge but in humility. A girl, hair tied tightly under her hard hat, squinted at a slope analysis chart. "Mr. Marcus," she said, "what if I'm sure the number's wrong but I'm the only one saying it?" Marcus didn't hesitate. "Then you say it louder," he said. "But not out of pride, out of duty." She looked unsure. "Even if they laugh?" He crouched beside her, pointing to a set of foundation fault lines marked in red on a practice sketch. "See this? It's from a real site." Only one person noticed the crack. The rest ignored him. "Know what happened?" She shook her head. "The building had to be shut down mid-construction," he said. "Millions lost. Not because someone was wrong, but because no one listened." He tapped the paper gently. "Courage isn't just about speaking up. It's about not going silent just because someone above you doesn't want to hear it." The girl nodded slowly, taking that in with a seriousness far beyond her years. Thomas watched from a distance. He didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. The repair was working, not just to Marcus but through him. Later that evening, Marcus sat alone in the site's converted shipping container-turned office, sorting through proposals for expanding the mentorship curriculum. The room was quiet except for the ticking of a modest desk clock and the occasional shouts from the evening shift outside. Then came a knock. Thomas entered without fanfare. Marcus stood but wasn't formal about it. He no longer felt the need to impress him. Thomas set down a folder. "Denver project's moving forward. They want a mentorship team there. Your name came up." Marcus blinked. "My name? Greg suggested it. So did 3 of your trainees." A long silence passed. Marcus looked down at his hands, rougher now from work, steadier from discipline. "I'm honored," he said honestly. "But I'm not ready to leave. Not yet." Thomas tilted his head. "Why?" "There's still work to do here," Marcus said. "Myra just got her first field approval. Terrence is halfway through the soil testing module. I promised I'd see them through." Thomas nodded. "No one's pushing you out. But you've earned trust again. People see it." Marcus gave a faint smile. "Funny. I spent 20 years trying to be respected. And I got it only after I stopped trying to look like I had all the answers." Thomas chuckled. "That's the secret." He stood, patting the folder. "You'll take over the Woodrow Center officially next quarter. Instructor-led. Mentor to mentors." Marcus's brow raised. "Isn't that supposed to go to a licensed director?" Thomas turned at the door. "It is. But you're not here because of a license. You're here because you earned something rarer, redemption." And then he was gone. 3 weeks later, the mentorship program received its first external inspection from the state's Vocational Certification Board. It was a formality for most companies, a checkbox. But for Eaglestone and Marcus in particular, it was a reckoning. The inspector, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Evelyn Thorne, spent 2 days reviewing lesson plans, sitting in on live training and interviewing students. She asked hard questions. She didn't offer smiles easily. At the end of her visit, she asked for a private word with Marcus. "You're not a traditional educator," she began. "No teaching degree. No background in vocational training." "I understand," Marcus said carefully. "But," she continued, You've transformed this center into one of the most effective real-world training spaces I've seen. He blinked. Thank you. She stood, gathering her files. You're being recommended for honorary instructor certification. Not because of your past, but because of what you're building now. She paused at the door. And Mr. Ellison? Yes. I've reviewed your previous projects. You weren't just technically sharp. You were brilliant. But arrogance dulls brilliance fast. What you're doing now. It's sharp again. Marcus didn't respond. He just nodded, deeply, humbly. Because that meant more than any plaque on a wall ever could. In December, the Eaglestone Foundation Forward event brought together stakeholders, media, and policy makers to showcase the evolution of the company's reform model. The keynote speaker wasn't Thomas Carter. It was Marcus. He stood before hundreds. The lights were bright. The cameras recorded every word. He cleared his throat, then began. A few years ago, I would have stood here and rattled off technical terms, percentages, and forecasts. I would have buried you in data, just so I didn't have to show you myself. He glanced at Thomas in the front row, who gave the slightest nod. But now I understand. The most important part of any building isn't the blueprint. It's the foundation. And that foundation isn't concrete. It's people. It's voices. It's truth. He paused, then looked around the room. I was wrong. I failed. I hurt others by thinking I was the only one who mattered in the room. But someone gave me a second chance. And now I spend every day helping others build, not just with their hands but with their courage. He smiled quietly. That's the strongest structure we can ever create. The room didn't erupt in applause. It stood. A standing ovation, not for a man who once led from the top, but for one who now led from the ground. And this time, Marcus Ellison didn't feel pride. He felt purpose. Spring arrived in the city like a second chance. The harsh winds softened, and the Eaglestone Tower, once a monument to steel, glass, and status, now stood as something more, a symbol of transformation. Not just in architecture but in culture. On a warm April morning, a group of wide-eyed interns filed into the 30th floor mentorship room. Among them was a girl named Celine, barely 19, sharp-tongued and sharper-minded. She carried a worn notebook filled with sketches, ideas, and questions no one had ever encouraged her to ask before. She was the kind of person the old Eaglestone system would have ignored. But not anymore. Marcus Ellison stood at the front of the room. He no longer carried the air of someone seeking approval. Instead, he wore his purpose like a uniform, quiet, functional, undeniable. He smiled at the group. Before we start, I want to ask something. The room hushed. If you're on site and you notice something no one else sees, a crack, a tilt, an error in the plan, but the person in charge dismisses you, what do? A few interns exchanged glances. Some hesitated. Celine raised her hand. You speak up anyway. Marcus nodded slowly. Why? Because buildings fall, she said. But they fall harder when people stay silent. A slow smile crept across Marcus's face. He tapped the whiteboard. Exactly. Behind her answer wasn't just technical understanding. It was inheritance. That same day, down in the tower's main lobby, a crowd gathered for a ceremony, simple, unadvertised, but deeply meaningful. Thomas Carter stood beside a newly installed glass panel, sunlight gleaming off the etched letters that now adorned the wall above the main entrance. Workers, engineers, former interns, and even janitorial staff stood shoulder to shoulder as he spoke. Eaglestone has never been just about buildings, he began. It's about the people who build them. He gestured to the plaque. This new dedication is not for one person or one event, but for every person who ever spoke up and wasn't heard, and every person who made the choice to start listening. The glass panel bore an inscription, simple and eternal. The strongest foundation is the courage to speak, and the humility to listen. There was no applause. No flashing cameras. Just stillness. The kind that comes after a storm, when you realize something solid has been built in its wake. Weeks passed. The mentorship program grew. Not just in numbers but in reputation. Schools began to send students not just for certification, but to witness a different way of leadership. And one day Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Jared. He looked different now. Older. Lighter. He was dressed in field gear, clipboard in hand. You got the Atlanta site job, Marcus said with a grin. Jared nodded, almost shy. I did. And I'm doing it right. They stood together at the edge of a model in the mentorship room, reviewing the design for a new training center being built near an underserved neighborhood in Memphis. You ever think, Jared asked, That maybe the worst day of your career was also your best? Marcus didn't answer right away. He picked up a pencil and adjusted a figure on the model, just slightly. Then he said, "It wasn't the worst day. The worst day was the one before it, when I thought I was right and refused to listen." He set the pencil down. "The day I was held accountable? That was the first real day of my career." Later that month, Myra, now a licensed field engineer, invited Marcus to speak at her first solo site briefing. She introduced him not as a former chief engineer, not even as her mentor, but as the man who taught me that leadership is listening, especially when it's hard. As Marcus watched her take the lead, confidently managing the team, reviewing safety protocols, fielding questions with poise, he realized something profound. He wasn't the foundation anymore. She was. They were. Every student, every worker, every voice that had once been ignored now stood as a pillar in a company that had been rebuilt not with steel or status, but with integrity. And he was okay with that. More than okay. He was proud. On the one-year anniversary of the Northeast Foundation incident, the day Marcus had humiliated the man he thought was a worker and learned instead he was the founder, a quiet tradition began. Each April 6th, Eaglestone hosted an internal gathering called the Listening Circle. No podiums. No ranks. Just people. Sharing moments where they spoke up, failed to, or learned the cost of silence. And each year the first to speak was Marcus. "I'm not here because I was right," he said. "I'm here because I finally learned how to be wrong, and do something about it." No one clapped. They just nodded. Because some truths don't need applause. They just need to be heard. The final scene unfolds in a quiet corner of the mentorship room, late at night. Marcus is alone, finishing up paperwork. Outside, the city sleeps, unaware of the quiet legacy being written inside this tower. He walks to the window and gazes out over the skyline. Then he takes out a stone from his pocket. A small, jagged piece of concrete from the original northeast corner, retrieved after the repairs, kept as a reminder. He places it on the shelf beside a framed photo of his first class at Woodrow. Then he turns off the light and walks out, leaving behind a foundation that now, finally, can stand. This is more than just a story about construction. It's a story about what happens when power is humbled, when truth is finally heard, and when redemption is earned, not handed. Marcus Ellison's journey reminds us that the strongest structures aren't made of steel or concrete, but of accountability, courage, and second chances. As Thomas Carter once said, the building doesn't collapse because of wind, but because of the silence of those who knew but didn't speak. Now we ask you, if you were in Thomas's position, would you have given Marcus a second chance? Let us know in the comments. If this story moved you, made you reflect, or reminded you that redemption is always possible, subscribe to True Echo, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and never underestimate the voice that comes from the ground. Because every tower begins not with design, but with the foundation beneath it.